Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now you might have read the title of this video and thought, what in the name of all clickbait is this? If I decided to change the title because I thought of something better shortly after upload like I usually do, then that previous statement will make no sense. But what you're seeing here is footage from a game that will run better on a $160 RX 6400 than a once $3,000 Titan V. The reason for that is because it won't actually start on GPUs that lack RT cores or Ray Accelerators. While ray tracing was made available with some GTX cards thanks to Nvidia drivers, a lack of physical capabilities proves problematic here. If you haven't guessed by now, this is of course Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. The original version was released back in early 2019 and visually it was and still is one of the best games I've ever set my eyes on. In May 2021 the enhanced upgrade became available as a free standalone download for existing owners, bringing with it additional ray tracing features, DLSS support on Nvidia cards and of course higher system requirements. Since then we've seen more ray tracing capable graphics cards launch, cards like the mid-range RTX 3050 from Nvidia, as well as the entry-level RX 6500 XT and RX 6400 from AMD. Today, I thought it would be interesting and possibly quite amusing to see how these cards handle Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. Up until this point I've been playing the game with an i3-12300 and RTX 2080 Super. Now that sounds like a horrible mismatch, I know, but actually the i3 is holding its own fairly well. The game is certainly more GPU intensive anyway. With this system, extreme quality settings, ultra ray tracing and ray traced reflections, we are able to achieve at least 60 FPS on average. DLSS is also switched off here, and so are some of the other choices as detailed on screen. In order to get ray traced reflections in this game, we have to set the quality preset to ultra or higher, so basically ultra or extreme. In order to bring those 1.1% lows up a bit, we could drop the visual quality settings slightly or enable DLSS, but I decided to keep things as they were during my gameplay session. These performance figures come from a combination of 3 in-game levels. I played through the Volga, Yamantau and Caspian chapters. The frame rate will vary between these levels and sometimes it will dip below 60 by quite some margin. Other areas will allow our FPS to hit over 80 or 90, but overall between 60 and 70 is where I noticed the game sit most of the time. The next card I tested was the RTX 3050, which was released after the game and caters to a more mid-range market, at least it's supposed to. The price of this card is definitely lower now than it was a couple of months ago, even a couple of weeks ago, but they might still be a little high in price where you live. I know they are here. Now surprisingly, or rather coincidentally, the frame rate figures with the 3050 were almost identical to that of the 2080 Super. Whoa, I know what you're thinking. The game was running at lower settings. Yeah, this card didn't match a 2080 Super with the same extreme preset. We had to turn a few things down a little bit. In order to retain the ray traced reflections option, I went for ultra quality overall, and I also turned the RT setting down too high from ultra. DLSS was also enabled here and set to quality mode. I have to say that DLSS in this game is really good. I can't notice the difference between it and native 1920 by 1080, at least not without a side-by-side image comparison. As I said before, it's over 60 FPS for the 8GB RTX 3050, a GPU that's shaping up to be one of my favourites. When this thing gets down to a sensible price, it will be highly regarded, sort of a go-to option at the mid-range, I reckon. By now you've seen how an ageing high-end card, namely the 2080 Super, handles this title, and you've witnessed the 3050 attempt to maintain a consistent 60 FPS. Both cards can play Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition well in their own right, and if you're not quite happy with what you've seen today, you can always go a little lower or a lot lower when it comes to the visual detail. Now though, and here is where things are about to get interesting, possibly frustrating. The RX 6500 XT and 6400. These entry-level AMD offerings both have ray tracing support for some reason, so we may as well see what they can do here. We won't be able to use DLSS, but if things get messy we can either use the game's built-in shading rate option, which can be used to alter the internal rendering resolution of the game, or we can use AMD RSR or Radeon Super Resolution from within the Radeon software to upscale Metro from a lower res to our monitor's native output, for example 720p to 1080p. First up then, let's start with the better of the two cards, the 6500 XT. I'm still using my i3 as part of my PCI Express 4.0 system, so this graphics card is going to be running at its best. Its best, unfortunately, isn't quite good enough to be able to keep ray traced reflections on. Remember, to do that we need the Ultra preset, but with Ultra and the rendering res set to 0.4, we aren't even able to hit 30 frames per second. Sometimes we can, but not very often and not continuously. This was expected, to be honest. Now, I didn't really want to sacrifice the ray traced reflections, not straight away, and instead of dropping the native resolution even further, I switched on RSR or Radeon Super Resolution instead and upscaled the game from 720 to 1080p. This still wasn't really enough to get a playable frame rate. I mean, it was close to 30 with moments above and below it, but there were too many inconsistencies, and when we got rushed by enemies or there were loads of fire effects on screen, Metro didn't hesitate to drop to under 20 frames per second. This was with the shading rate set to 1 again. Now, to complicate things a bit more, I dropped the shading rate option back to 0.4 and who knows what was going on in the background. I'm surprised the game didn't crash. We've still got RSR enabled, so we're essentially upscaling the game from 720p to 1080p, all while rendering the game at 40% resolution from the in-game menu. I mean, is one setting overriding the other, or is the upscaled 720p to 1080p actually not upscaling to 1080p, rather 40% of it? I have no idea how things are working, but the frame rate did hit at least 30 FPS and beyond, and technically the RX 6500 is running the game better than a Titan V or GTX 1080 Ti, because those two cards can't even start it. And that's pretty funny to think about, even though you'd be better off with the standard Metro Exodus game. I'm sort of glad that AMD did include ray tracing capabilities with this card, because it's fun to see what it can and can't run. Some areas of the game will hit over 60 FPS, but open outdoor spaces will cripple the performance. It's very much a bittersweet experience, with more bitter by far. Realistically though, with this version of the game you'd want to choose the low quality preset and the normal ray tracing option, with everything else still set to off. Combined with RSR once again, and running at an upscaled 720 to 1080p, this time we're seeing over 40 FPS. It's probably one of the least smooth plus 40 FPS experiences I've ever experienced, even though the percentile figures aren't too bad on paper. It just feels really juddery to play. Now then, let's finalise with the RX 6400, and again there's no two ways about this. The lowest settings with ray tracing set to normal is the best way to go. RSR is still enabled here too, so once again we're upscaling from 720 to 1080p. 6400 users should most definitely stick to the standard game, but to repeat my earlier point, this game will start and run on AMD's currently lowest end ray tracing capable GPU, even if the gameplay experience leaves a lot to be desired. Some levels, like the Volga here, will hit and exceed 60 FPS at the lowest settings, just like when using the 6500. The results aren't too dissimilar in areas like this actually. In those bigger, brighter and well lit areas, this is where the entry-level AMD cards start to falter. Just like the 6500 XT, once again the 6400 can start and play the game, and it can be somewhat enjoyed, but the 1.1% figures reflect a messy experience, and one that was to be expected in all honesty. Still, the card gave it a good try, and that's all I can ever ask. I wanted to take a look at Metro Exodus today because it remains one of the best looking games around, and the enhanced version even more so. It's certainly worth a play if you've got a mid-range RT capable GPU, perhaps a 6600 or higher on the AMD side of things, and a 3050 or better from Nvidia. But if not, well, you can always download and install the standard version, which in its own right is still absolutely fantastic to look at. That's all for this one then. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.